Hi, I'm Professor Jeffrey Sachs, professor at Columbia University in Sustainable Development, and absolutely delighted that you are joining this course on extractive industries and sustainable development. It's a great pleasure for me to join you on this Google Hangout and to have a chance to answer some of the questions that have come up early in the course. I serve as special advisor to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres on the Sustainable Development Goals. And I can tell you that the questions that you're asking, how these goals can be achieved, what is the role of the extractive sector in achieving them, how can we improve global governance, are among the most important and operational we face in the world to turn the world in the direction of sustainable development. Well, many of you have sent in really excellent questions, and they group around three big areas, three big themes. And in my brief remarks with you today, I'd like to answer these three big questions. The first question is about the role of transparency. Why is that so important? Why is there emphasis put on transparency in the extractive sector? Can it really work? The second question is about the resource curse. That's a topic that I've been writing about for 20 years or more, and it's something that I'd like to share some thoughts with you in this hangout. And the third question is a general framing question, which is indeed at the core of this entire course, and that is, in what ways can the extractive sector contribute to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals? So let me talk about transparency. The essence of the challenge of the extractive sector, whether it's hydrocarbons like oil and gas, or diamonds, or gold mining, or mining of other very high value minerals, is that there's a natural rent or an income that is the return to the scarcity of these commodities, which means that there is an income flow from the mining sector that can easily be extracted if you're able to gain control of that income flow. This is different from other economic activities that are the returns perhaps to the inputs of labor or the inputs of factory machinery, where it's not so easy to gain control of those rents. So in the politics of extractive industries, he who controls the mining site, he who controls the oil and gas concessions, of course, has the hands on tremendously valuable resources. And by seizing control through politics or through war or through violence, it's possible, of course, to grab control of that income stream. And similarly, by having a hidden control of this income or non-transparent uses of this income, it's possible to divert these rents, these resource returns, to personal use in mega amounts, in the tune of billions and billions of dollars. And so the extractive sector really is unique, I would say, in the economy, in the capacity of those with power and secrecy to appropriate the returns in the economy on a macroeconomic scale, something that's not so easy to do if you're talking about other kinds of income flows where you have to go through formal taxation, or it's not so easy to hide the abuses that come from this income. The implication is very clear and very much revealed throughout history, and that is that the extractive sectors have been centers of tremendous criminality, a tremendous illicit misdirection of resources that should flow to government coffers, but instead end up in the private hands of individuals of power. This is a sector that is tremendously vulnerable to bribery because it pays an international company to bribe a local official for the rights to a mineral concession. And all of this means that the transparency issue of this sector is of the utmost concern to good public policy. So what we have in the world in recent years is several initiatives, very worthy, like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or EITI, or the initiative Publish What You Pay, or the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which in the United States and similar legislation in other countries aims to prevent bribery by international corporations, or a rule that was put in place in the United States called the Carden-Lugar rule after the 2008 financial crisis, which called on countries to and companies to publish the revenues that they're giving to foreign governments relative to extractive industries. Now, it's a telling sign that as soon as the Trump administration came into office, the very first action of the Congress under the Republican control was to repeal the Carden-Lugar transparency rule. And this is basically, in my view, saying nothing more than we want the license to be corrupt. And it is a repeal of this rule pushed by the American oil and gas and mining sector because they are corrupt and they have what to hide. And there are excuses that, oh, this was onerous to report, this was costly to us, this was unfair competition with that limited our ability to compete, mainly our ability to bribe with other countries. All are fallacious or insidious propositions. So the fact that the Congress took the time to repeal a transparency clause as one of its first acts under the Trump administration shows that they want the license to bribe, to steal, and to cheat. I don't think that there's any other conclusion that can be given to this. Now, for all of you around the world, in countries that host the mining sector because there are diamonds or gold or copper resources or oil and gas reserves, this is a matter of great concern. Whether the United States requires its companies to publish what they pay, civil society in all countries should be insisting that their governments hold transparent accounts. This is not easy. We know how much corruption there is in the extractive industry sector. We know how concessions are determined by bribes. We know how major companies in the world, Halliburton and other companies, have been found guilty pretty frequently in many cases of illegal activities. We know, by the way, that trillions of dollars sit in tax havens in the Caribbean or in Mauritius or in London for that matter, or in the United States in particular states, or in Switzerland, to evade taxes because these are the rents of the extractive sector that were not transparently traced and that have ended up in hidden accounts protected from outside view. And of course, we're all familiar with the infamous Panama Files which were the leaked documents of a law firm which specialized in the business of creating anonymous accounts or dummy corporations for the point of view of hiding these assets. So yes, transparency is central, it's vital, it is achievable, but it is resisted from the forces of criminality, often within the extractive sector. And I call on leaders of the extractive industries to step forward and say, we want these regulations. We want our money being properly directed. I call on heads of state in countries with large extractive industries to step forward and say, we want the publication, transparency of contracts, of the flow of funds. And I'll return to this issue in a few minutes when I talk about the extractive industry more generally. But this is to say that the transparency question, which came up in many of the questions to me, is extremely important. Now, it relates to the second set of questions that came to me on the resource curse. Many, many years ago, in papers that I wrote with colleagues looking at economic growth in countries with different structures of the economy, I found with my colleagues that countries that are highly dependent on the mining sector through oil, gas, gold, diamonds, and so forth, tended to have lower economic growth than countries that were dependent on manufacturing or agriculture or service sector exports. And this research, together with research in the political science community, became known as the resource curse, as the paradox that sometimes having natural resources could be a kind of Midas curse, if we remember the great mythology of King Midas, whose touch turned everything to gold, and who ended up destroying his family and his world because of the destructive power of greed. The resource curse is a real phenomenon, and many of you asked me the question, what causes the resource curse? Well, there are two kinds of resource curses that have been identified, one political and one economic. The political resource curse is that the existence of these large income flows from the extractive sector leads to bad politics. For some of the reasons that I've already been discussing, for the corruption reason, for example, or the reason that resources often give rise to civil war, because if you can win the power of the state, then you can win the large rents that flow from the resource deposits. So in this sense, politics is highly vulnerable to conflict. And another idea that is very much alive in political science analysis is the idea that when governments have to tax the public, they have to win the consent of the people to pay taxes. They have to show that their taxes are being well used. But when governments are just able to use the resource rents from the extractive sector, then it's quite possible that they behave very badly. They're not constrained to convince the public of anything. They don't have to win the public confidence. They don't have to win votes in parliament. They have their own resource flow that maybe they use for military adventures or for personal embezzlement, but without the oversight of parliament. So one part of the resource curse is precisely the political resource curse. There's another idea of the resource curse, and that is the economic resource curse, sometimes called the Dutch disease. The idea of the Dutch disease is that if you have a large resource sector like the Dutch have with North Sea oil and gas, and hence the term Dutch disease, then the wealth that comes from those resources lead to a big boost of demand in the economy for domestic services. And that bids up the wages and the prices in sectors like real estate or domestic finance or wholesale and retail trade. And that bidding up of the wages causes the other internationally traded sectors like manufacturing and agriculture to suffer. They can't compete. Sometimes the exchange rate rises or appreciates, as we say, so that the large resource flows lead to an overvalued currency combined with higher wages in the service economy. And the result of all of this is that the other tradable sectors of the economy, like manufactured goods, industrial products, agriculture products, become uncompetitive when there's a large extractive industry sector. That's the so-called Dutch disease, or the economic resource curse. Well, if those other sectors, like manufacturing, are sources of long-term growth, if they're sources of learning by doing, if they're sources of technology improvement, then the implication is that by directing resources away from those other tradable sectors, the extractive industries end up pushing resources towards services or to financialization or to real estate, and push work and output away from the so-called other traditional tradable sectors like industry, like manufacturing. And in the long term, the economy suffers because it doesn't have the dynamism, the learning, and the technological progress. And so countries that have a large extractive sector have to take special care to make sure that their other tradable sectors, like manufacturing, do not become uncompetitive, that the currency does not become unrealistically overvalued, that the long-term productivity of the economy is protected, that learning by doing and education are given emphasis, that the benefits of the extractive industries are consciously directed towards research and development, towards science, towards higher education, towards skills, so that the economy does not lose its competitiveness in the non-extractive tradable sectors. So to summarize, the resource curse is a real phenomenon. Politics can go very badly wrong. The economy can shift resources away from the long-term dynamic sectors. There's nothing inevitable about the resource curse. Countries with large resource sectors can still do very well over time. Norway has done very well. Chile, as a developing country, has done very well. Botswana was able to use its diamond wealth to build its infrastructure and its skills. But this requires a conscious effort of good politics and a conscious effort of overcoming the Dutch disease in order to overcome the economic aspects of the resource curse. The third question that many of you asked me was a general question. I'm not going to go into all the details because that's the purpose of this course. But the question is how the mining sector can contribute to sustainable development. How can extractives work for the benefit of the country? And many of you pointed out that it seems almost intrinsic to the mining sector that there's pollution, that there's inequality, maybe bad politics. And so can the extractive sector really contribute to sustainable development? Well, let me remind you, first of all, what is sustainable development? Sustainable development means economic development that is fair, and that is environmentally sustainable. So it means the triple bottom line: economic prosperity, economic justice or fairness, and environmental sustainability. Can the extractive sector contribute to sustainable development? The answer is yes, but it requires very conscious effort. It requires very focused effort to overcome the Dutch disease. It requires very focused environmental policies to ensure that the processes of extraction themselves do not destabilize the environment. And it requires a very conscious effort to be fair in the use of the resources. So I won't go into detail on all of those dimensions, because that, after all, is a major purpose of this course. But let me say a few of the pillars of sustainability and sustainable development of the extractive sector. The first pillar is transparency. As I emphasized right at the start, we need to know what are the sources of resource earnings or rents, where does the money flow, how is it effectively used. A second pillar often is to establish a special fund in the government that is the fund for the returns to the oil and gas sector, or the returns to the copper sector in Chile, or the returns to diamonds or gold or other high-valued minerals in countries that mine those minerals. Why a separate fund? Because then it's easier to trace the uses, the benefits, the stability of those resource flows. A third pillar is long-term planning. A key part of making sure that the extractive sector turns into sustainable development is to plan investments that translate the income flows of oil, gas, gold, diamonds, copper into investments in infrastructure, investments in skills, investments in local communities, investments in overcoming poverty. And so having a long-term plan that says we have these resource flows over the next few decades, and we are going to use those resource flows to invest in our capital stock of infrastructure, of business capital, of human capital, skills and healthcare, is crucial. This is especially important when the natural resource is limited and exhaustible. In other words, when the mining is going to cause it to run out. Then you want to turn the short-term income flows into long-term national benefits. So planning intertemporally across time over the course of even decades, as Norway does, is extremely important. The resources can be put into a sovereign wealth fund, for example, that invests for the long-term benefit of the community and of the nation. One of the things that you're going to be studying is the use of infrastructure in the extractive sector also for more general benefits. Suppose that railroads are built from the mines to the ports. Well, those railroads can be used not only for mining, but also for the farmers that are along the corridor of transport. Suppose that power generation is needed to run the mining sites. That power generation can also be used for the national power grid. So dual use infrastructure is another pillar of ensuring that the extractive sector is used sustainably. And finally, a fifth component that involves fairness is to make sure that the rents or the income flows from the extractive sector are distributed in a just way within the society. I think there are two parts of that. One is that a significant proportion of the income stream from the extractive sector should flow to the national budget through a specialized, transparently managed fund, could be a sovereign wealth fund, so that it's for the benefit of the whole nation, including even future generations. A second part of the fairness is to make sure that the local communities that are host to the mining sites and that are sometimes disrupted by the mining are also beneficiaries. So in most countries, a certain fraction of the overall income generation from the natural resources go to the benefit of the localities and the local regions. And that kind of local development and respecting the local rights, sometimes of indigenous populations, is an extremely important part of making sure that the extractive industries produce sustainable development. So all of these ideas, these pillars of transparency, of a dedicated fund, of long-term planning, of dual-use infrastructure, of funding of local communities are pillars of sustainable development of the extractive industries. Well, you're going to be studying all of this in a lot more detail, so I just wanted to touch the surface of these issues. Thank you for the three big questions, one on transparency and the extractive sector, the second one on the resource curse, and the third one on the general relationship of the extractive sector to sustainable development. I hope that I've at least whetted your appetite. I'd really appreciate the chance to have this hangout with you, and I really wish you all the best in this course and look forward to having long-term interactions with you. I'm sure you're in this course because you're working to ensure that extractive industries promote sustainable development. That's my objective also as director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and as special advisor to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres on the Sustainable Development Goals. So pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to more interactions.